Before starting the story, please like and subscribe the channel. I am just an old lad that is trying hard to get by. Okay, let's dive into the story. Watch till the end because this story will make you think twice about RV camping. I had always looked forward to road trips with my husband Mark. The open road, the changing scenery, and the freedom to explore wherever we wanted felt like the perfect escape from our busy lives. This trip, however, was different. It began with excitement, but quickly turned into a nightmare that I still can't believe happened. It started on a sunny morning as we set off in our old but reliable RV. We had planned this trip for months, mapping out the route, packing our favorite snacks, and making sure everything was in order. We were heading towards a secluded campground in the mountains, hoping for a peaceful retreat. The first day was uneventful, filled with laughter, good music, and the joy of being together. We drove through picturesque towns and lush countryside, stopping occasionally to stretch our legs or grab a bite to eat. By evening, we found a cozy spot to park the RV for the night. As we settled in, I felt a sense of contentment. Little did I know our lives were about to take a terrifying turn. The next morning, we hit the road early, eager to make progress on our journey. As we drove through a dense forest, the radio, which had been playing our favorite tunes, suddenly crackled and went silent. Mark fiddled with the dial, trying to find a station, when a voice broke through the static. "This is a warning to all travelers," the voice said, sounding distant and eerie. "Stay away from the roads. Danger is imminent." We looked at each other, puzzled. Mark laughed nervously. "Probably just a prank or some emergency broadcast," he said, trying to brush it off. But something about the voice sent a shiver down my spine. We continued driving, but the feeling of unease lingered. An hour later, we came across a car accident. It was as if the voice had predicted it. The sight of the mangled vehicle and the injured driver being helped by paramedics was unsettling. We exchanged worried glances but didn't talk about it. As we moved on, the radio crackled again. The same voice, now clearer, spoke. "Two travelers will soon face a choice. Left leads to safety, right leads to peril." Mark turned the volume down, shaking his head. "This is getting weird." A few miles down the road, we reached a fork. The left path was paved and well-maintained, while the right was a rough dirt road. "What do you think?" Mark asked, uncertainty in his voice. Remembering the broadcast, I urged him to go left. We followed the paved road, but it wasn't long before we encountered a detour sign. The road was closed for repairs. With no other choice, we turned back and took the right path. As we bumped along the dirt road, the sky grew darker, and a sense of dread settled over us. The radio stayed silent for a while, allowing us to relax slightly. But then, as the sun began to set, the voice returned. "Beware the darkness. Night brings the unseen." Goosebumps prickled my skin. I glanced at Mark, who was gripping the steering wheel tightly. "We should stop for the night," he said, his voice strained. We found a clearing off the road and parked the RV. The forest around us was eerily quiet. As we prepared dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig outside made me jump. Mark tried to comfort me, but he was clearly on edge too. In the early hours of the morning, we heard a soft tapping on the RV door. We froze, listening intently. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice shaking. There was no answer, just more tapping. He grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door. The beam of light revealed nothing but empty darkness. The tapping stopped, and we were left in silence. The next morning, we were both exhausted but eager to leave. As we drove, the radio crackled to life once more. "The journey continues. Trust no one." Mark turned it off, frustration evident on his face. "This is ridiculous. We need to find help." We drove for hours without seeing another vehicle or person. The isolation was suffocating. Eventually, we reached a small town. Relief washed over us as we pulled into a gas station. While Mark filled the tank, I went inside to ask for directions. The old man behind the counter looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear when I mentioned the voice on the radio. "You need to leave this place," he said urgently. "Get back on the highway and don't stop until you're far away." His words sent chills down my spine, but I nodded and hurried back to the RV. "We need to go," I told Mark. He didn't argue. We quickly left the town, heading back towards the highway. As we drove, the radio remained off, and we tried to focus on reaching our destination. But the sense of dread never left us. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the voice returned, louder and more menacing than before. The final warning, your time is running out. My heart pounded in my chest. We need to get out of here, I said, panic rising in my voice. Mark nodded, speeding up. But the road seemed to stretch endlessly, and no matter how fast we drove, we couldn't escape the feeling of impending doom. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered and died. The RV coasted to a stop, and we were left in darkness. Mark tried to restart the engine, but it was no use. What do we do now? He asked, fear in his eyes. Before I could answer, the tapping began again, louder and more aggressive this time. It sounded like dozens of hands were beating against the RV. We huddled together, terrified. The radio crackled one last time. It's too late. The tapping stopped abruptly, and an eerie silence fell over us. We stayed in the RV, too afraid to move or make a sound. Hours passed, and eventually exhaustion overtook us. We fell into a fitful sleep, haunted by nightmares. When we woke up, it was morning. The RV started without issue, and we wasted no time getting back on the road. The sense of urgency drove us forward, and we didn't stop until we reached a busy highway. The nightmare seemed to be over, but the fear lingered. We never spoke of the trip again. The memory of that voice, the predictions and the terrifying events haunted us for years. To this day, I can't listen to the radio without a sense of dread. I don't know what it was that we encountered on that road, but I hope never to experience anything like it again. As we merged onto the highway, the comforting hum of traffic surrounded us. For a while, it felt like we had escaped the nightmare, but the relief was short-lived. The radio, which had been off since that last terrifying broadcast, suddenly turned on by itself. The voice, now familiar and even more ominous, spoke again. The final test awaits. Your journey is not over. Mark and I exchanged horrified looks. Turn it off, I whispered, my voice trembling. He reached for the dial, but it wouldn't budge. The voice continued, describing a series of events that seemed impossible, but eerily specific. You will face a choice at the next crossroads. Choose wisely or suffer the consequences. Mark swerved to the side of the road and brought the RV to a stop. What the hell is going on? He shouted, slamming his fist on the steering wheel. Why is this happening to us? I had no answers. Fear gripped my heart as I stared at the radio, which now lay silent. We need to keep moving, I said, trying to stay calm. We can't let this thing control us. Reluctantly, Mark started the RV again, and we continued down the highway. About an hour later, we reached a junction. The sign indicated that the left road led to a nearby city, while the right road continued into a remote, less traveled area. Which way? Mark asked, anxiety clear in his voice. I thought about the old man's warning at the gas station and the voice's predictions. We should go left, I said. We need to get to a city, find more people. Maybe they'll know what's happening. Mark nodded and turned left. The road was busy, and the presence of other cars provided a small measure of comfort. However, the sense of unease never left us. The city skyline appeared on the horizon, but the closer we got, the more the tension grew. As we drove into the city, the radio turned on again. This time, the voice was accompanied by eerie music, a haunting melody that made my skin crawl. Welcome to the city of shadows. Beware of those who seem familiar. The streets were bustling, but something felt off. People moved about their daily lives, but their faces seemed devoid of emotion, their movements mechanical. We parked the RV in a crowded lot and stepped out, hoping to find someone who could help us. We approached a woman who was walking her dog. Excuse me, Mark said, trying to sound normal. Can you tell us where we can find a mechanic? The woman turned to us with a blank stare. The mechanic is waiting, she said in a monotone voice, pointing down the street. Follow the signs. A chill ran down my spine. Thank you, I said, forcing a smile. As we walked away, I whispered to Mark, something's not right here. We followed the signs and found a small garage with a mechanic working on a car. He looked up as we approached and smiled, but there was something unsettling about his expression. Need some help? He asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Our RV broke down, Mark explained. Can you take a look at it? The mechanic nodded. Sure thing. Bring it over. We drove the RV into the garage and the mechanic began his inspection. As he worked, I glanced around nervously. The city seemed normal on the surface, but there was an underlying eeriness that I couldn't shake. After a few minutes, the mechanic emerged from under the hood. "Looks like your engine's in good shape," he said, frowning. "I can't find anything wrong with it." Mark and I exchanged puzzled looks. "But it died on us," Mark insisted. "It wouldn't start until this morning." The mechanic shrugged. "Sometimes these things happen. I suggest you stay in the city for the night. There's a motel down the street. I'll keep an eye on your RV. Make sure everything's in order." Reluctantly, we agreed. We thanked the mechanic and walked to the motel, our unease growing with each step. The receptionist greeted us with the same blank stare we had seen in the woman earlier. "Welcome," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Your room is ready." We took the key and headed to our room. The motel was clean, but there was an oppressive atmosphere that made it hard to relax. We sat on the bed, trying to make sense of everything. "This place is creepy," I said, shivering. "We need to get out of here as soon as possible." Mark nodded. "First thing in the morning, we'll check the RV again and head out. Let's just try to get some rest tonight." We settled into the uncomfortable bed, but sleep was elusive. Every creak of the building, every murmur from the hallways outside made us jump. My mind raced with the events of the past few days. What was this voice on the radio? How could it know so much about our journey? Sometime in the middle of the night, I finally drifted into a restless sleep. My dreams were filled with shadowy figures and whispered warnings. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat and with my heart pounding. Mark was also tossing and turning, his face etched with worry even in his sleep. Morning couldn't come soon enough. As soon as the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, we got up and hurried out of the motel. The city was just starting to wake up, and the streets were eerily quiet. We made our way back to the garage where the mechanic was waiting. He greeted us with the same unsettling smile. "Morning," he said. "Your RV is all set. I couldn't find any issues, so you should be good to go." "Thanks," Mark said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. We quickly got into the RV and drove out of the city, eager to put as much distance between us and that place as possible. For a while, everything seemed normal. The RV ran smoothly, and we made good time on the highway. But the tension between us remained. We barely spoke, each lost in our own thoughts. Then as we drove through a stretch of empty road, the radio crackled to life once more. The same haunting melody played, followed by the ominous voice. "Your time is running out. The final test is near." I felt a wave of panic wash over me. "We need to turn it off," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't keep listening to this." Mark nodded and reached for the dial, but the radio wouldn't turn off. The voice continued, describing a scenario that sent chills down my spine. "At the next junction, you must make a choice. Only one path leads to freedom." We drove in silence, the voice echoing in our minds. Soon we reached another fork in the road. This time there were no signs to guide us. The left path led into a dense forest, while the right continued along the barren highway. "What do we do?" Mark asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. I thought about all the previous warnings and how they had eerily come true. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we can't just sit here. We have to choose." Mark gripped the steering wheel tightly. "The forest looks safer than the highway. Let's try that." We turned left, the RV rumbling down the narrow winding path into the forest. The trees closed in around us, casting long shadows that danced in the morning light. The further we went, the darker and more oppressive the forest became. After what felt like hours, we emerged into a small clearing. A dilapidated cabin stood in the center, surrounded by overgrown weeds. There was an eerie stillness in the air, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. "I don't like this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We should keep moving." Mark nodded, but before we could start the engine, the radio crackled again. The voice was clearer than ever. "You have chosen wisely. The test begins now." My heart pounded in my chest as the voice faded, leaving us in silence. We looked around, trying to figure out what the voice meant by test. The cabin seemed abandoned, but there was something unsettling about it. "We need to check it out," Mark said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "Maybe there's something inside that will help us understand what's happening." Reluctantly, I agreed. We got out of the RV and approached the cabin, our footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The door creaked open with a gentle push, revealing a dark interior. Mark turned on his flashlight and we cautiously stepped inside. The cabin was filled with old dusty furniture and cobwebs. It looked like it hadn't been occupied for years. As we explored, we found a table with an old radio on it. The sight of it made my blood run cold. "This can't be a coincidence," I said, staring at the radio. "It's like the one in our RV." Mark examined it closely. It's even tuned to the same frequency, but it's not plugged in. Suddenly, the radio sprang to life, the same haunting melody playing. The voice followed, more menacing than ever. "Your final test is here. Survive the night, and you will be free." The radio went silent, leaving us in a heavy, oppressive silence. "What does that mean?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "Survive the night? What are we supposed to do?" Mark looked around, his face pale. "We need to stay alert. Whatever happens, we stick together. Let's barricade ourselves in here until morning." We spent the next hour securing the cabin as best as we could, pushing furniture against the doors and windows. As the sun set, the forest grew even darker, the shadows outside the cabin seeming to move and shift. We sat in the center of the cabin, clutching each other's hands, waiting for whatever was coming. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Every creak and groan of the old cabin set my nerves on edge. Then, just as we were starting to relax, a loud bang echoed through the cabin. We jumped to our feet, our hearts racing. The banging continued, growing louder and more insistent. "It's like the tapping we heard on the RV," I whispered, my voice shaking. Mark nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Stay close," he said, grabbing a heavy flashlight. "We need to see what's making that noise." We moved cautiously through the cabin, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The banging seemed to be coming from the back door. As we approached, it suddenly stopped. Mark slowly opened the door, and we were met with an eerie silence. There was no one there, just the dark forest stretching out before us. We closed the door and turned to head back inside when we heard it again, this time from the front of the cabin. We rushed back, but again, there was nothing. The cycle continued throughout the night, the banging moving from one part of the cabin to another, always just out of sight. It was as if we were being toyed with, driven to the brink of madness by an unseen force. Hours passed, and the night seemed endless. We were exhausted, but the fear kept us alert. As dawn finally began to break, the banging stopped, and a strange calm settled over the cabin. The radio crackled to life one last time. "Congratulations! You have survived the night. Your journey is over." We stared at the radio in disbelief, too drained to feel any sense of relief. Mark turned it off, and we sat in silence, the weight of the past day's events pressing down on us. "We need to leave this place," I said finally. "We need to get back to our lives." Mark nodded. "Let's go." We gathered our things and left the cabin, the morning light filtering through the trees. As we got back into the RV and started the engine, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we really were free. The drive back to the highway was uneventful. We didn't speak much, each lost in our own thoughts. The radio remained silent, and for the first time in days, we felt a sense of normalcy returning. When we finally reached a bustling town, we decided to stop and take a break. We parked the RV and walked around, mingling with the people and enjoying the sights and sounds of civilization. It felt surreal after everything we had been through. We found a small cafe and sat down for a meal, savoring the simple pleasure of good food and company. As we ate, we talked about the future, about putting the whole ordeal behind us. But as we paid the bill and got up to leave, something caught my eye. The old man behind the counter was watching us with an intense, knowing gaze. His eyes seemed to bore into mine, and a chill ran down my spine. "Is everything all right?" Mark asked, noticing my discomfort. I forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah, let's go." We walked back to the RV, but the sense of unease returned. As we drove out of town, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, still being followed. The voice on the radio had said our journey was over, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The events of the past days had left a mark on us, a lingering darkness that we couldn't escape. As we merged onto the highway and continued our journey, I glanced at the radio, half expecting it to come to life again. But it remained silent, and the miles stretched out before us. Our road trip had turned into a nightmare, a test of endurance and survival that had changed us forever. We had faced our fears and come out the other side, but the scars remained. And as we drove towards an uncertain future, I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors awaited us on the road ahead.